Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hey, friend, and welcome to episode 200 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. Today, I am here with my co-host, Holly. So we are super excited to be with you and to be celebrating 200 episodes.
200!
Woo!
It feels crazy that we've made it to this high number.
I know. Yes. And if you're listening right now and you're like, oh, great, they're going to do another celebration episode. Nope, we're not going to, because we just did the 4-year anniversary episode, I don't know, a couple of months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to keep it to a topic today, right, Holly?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to share what we're going to talk about today?
Well, okay. So I will in a second, but I do think it's okay for us to celebrate for a second.
Oh, well, of course.
Do you?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't need to do a full episode, but we've had a lot of really great guests, and you've done a lot of solos, and we've done a lot together. And it's just, I don't know, it's really cool that we have 200 episodes of content. I feel like that is blowing my mind.
Yeah. Now we have officially definitely interviewed over 100 people, because the 200 episodes, we actually have more episodes than that, because there's been bonuses and extra things thrown in there that aren't numbered. So we're really grateful for you as a listener. We're grateful for all of our guests, and we're grateful for everybody who has supported the podcast along the way and helped us to get to 200. Our editor, our team, all the things.
And I think part of the reason that we've been able to get this far is that we're trying to always bring you the topics that you want to hear about. And that's exactly what we're doing today.
That's right. Yeah.
So we did a poll in our Facebook group, and we asked what kind of was on everyone's mind and what they really wanted to talk about. And boundaries was definitely a top item that was something people are dealing with. So we are going to be talking about boundaries today. We're going to talk about what they are, why we need them, where do we need them, and how to set them. But you did an episode in the past about boundaries. Do you want to tell us about it?
Sure. Yeah. I was when I did the poll, I just put a bunch of ideas on there, and, I put boundaries because it's something that I know comes up from time to time in conversations with people. But then boundaries got the top number of votes by far in the poll. And I was like, I think I've done an episode before about this, but it was way back, episode 20. So in the first 6 months of the podcast, it was about 3 reasons boundaries are critical for leadership. And so if you want to hear that one, we're going to try not to repeat too much, but honestly, it's been so long that I really can't remember much of what I said. I had to go back and look at the show notes and be like, what did I say in this episode? And Holly, you didn't even remember that it existed. So it was a solo episode that I did. So again, that is a resource for you. The other thing we want to say about this is, as we often say, Holly and I are not experts in this topic. We are simply going to share some things from our life experience and things that we've learned through different books and resources that we have accessed in our own journeys. So we're going to, at the end, we're just going to share with you a few recommended resources if you want to dive deeper into this topic. But again, knowing that we are not the ultimate boundary experts on this topic. So I don't think that we really have to say that, but we just like to cover our bases and make sure we're not overstepping, saying we are the world-renowned experts in this.
No. But I do think that we've both been through lots of life experiences where we've had to use boundaries. And I feel like resources are amazing and we should always look for outside help, but sometimes experience can be the best teacher. Is that an actual quote? I think it might be.
I'm sure it is. You were the first person to ever say that.
Yeah. Genius right there, people.
Well, let's start with talking about what boundaries are.
Okay.
All right. How are we defining boundaries? I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah. So boundaries are lines that we draw to delineate where something stops and something else starts. So that's like the very, very basic idea of what a boundary is. So it's sort of like keeping something in or keeping something out. Mm-hmm. You've heard people say a line in the sand. It's kind of like drawing out your boundary markers. It's saying this is where this stops. So when we talk about them as far as not just like physical boundaries, when we talk about ourselves and in relationship to others, it's things we won't do, things we will do, things we won't allow other people to do. Kind of like a set of rules almost. And I know some of us don't like rules. I'm raising my hand, but
yes,
we'll talk about why we need them in just a second. But one thing that I want to kind of lift out of this is oftentimes when we talk about boundaries, we think about them in the context of relationships. And we're going to talk a lot about that. But I also want you to remember that boundaries are something that we also need for ourselves with, just our own self-awareness, self-growth, sort of the things that we need for ourselves to stay healthy. So as we talk about this, I want you to hear that we are talking about relationships, but a lot of this can be in the context of just within our own self-growth, our minds, what we do, what we don't do.
Yeah,
so,
I agree. And we'll talk about why we need them next. And I think I really like that you pointed that out because I do think there is sometimes this negative connotation with boundaries that people feel like it's always about something bad. Like you have to set a boundary when something bad is happening. And that really isn't necessarily true. And a lot of times boundaries are, if we do them proactively, they actually can really allow us a lot more freedom, a lot more benefits in our lives if we set them before we end up in a situation that is challenging. So why we need boundaries? Well, like Holly said, they kind of say where something starts and where something stops. And I think about it like when I'm driving on the road, there are boundaries on the road, right? Like there are the lines on the side. And then if you're on a dangerous like mountainside, there's guardrails, there's fences along the edge that help us to know, hey, don't drive over here in the ditch because it's going to hurt your car. You're probably going to get into an accident or you might go careening off the cliff. Boundaries keep us safe. They are there to help us stay safe. They're not there to restrict us, but sometimes they can feel restricting if we are like someone who doesn't like rules, like you said. But they also help us a lot of times to preserve things. So maybe preserving peace, safety, preserving yourself, family harmony, all of those kinds of things. When we have boundaries in place, that's part of what they can do. And they also help us to define our own behavior and decide what we're going to allow ourselves to do or allow other people to do to us. And we're going to kind of dig into that a little bit more as we go into like where we need boundaries. But overall, I think what we want to make sure we understand is that boundaries are something that can be good for us and can help us rather than looking at them as something restrictive or difficult.
I like that you used the road analogy because honestly, it made me think of like the center line in the road keeps us really healthy and safe. And it's like, I'm not allowed to go over that center line and cross into traffic that's coming my way. And it like, you can look at it and go, well, I really hate that double yellow line or like the one line or whatever it is. Like it just wants to keep me on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. Like it wants to keep me wherever I'm supposed to be. And we can get angry at it, or we can be like, that line, that painted line keeps me from dying.
Right. And I think the reason I like this analogy too is like in certain circumstances, there are times where that middle line is dotted and you're allowed to pass and go around another car, right? And so it's a similar thing. Boundaries are not always like this set in stone, like stone wall that you can't pass through. There are times where there might be circumstances when you adapt a boundary or you change a boundary for a particular reason. So anyway,
well, and I think you and I have both been to countries where those lines really don't mean a whole lot to people.
Or they just don't exist. Or they've been places where they don't even exist. It's really scary.
Yeah.
It is really scary driving or riding in a vehicle in places where there are no boundaries on how you drive on the road.
Well, and I think that is a great example. If you're heading into a situation where you don't know where the boundaries are, it can be scary. Is that person going to come straight towards me? Like, what are the rules here? What's allowed? What's not allowed? And it's like, I mean, when you think about it in this driving example, like we could take this all the way. I feel like there's a book here. Okay, before we get too far into that, we should just move on. But I think this analogy might carry with us through the rest of this episode.
Well, and I've thought about that before because a lot of times we think about this. I think about this in the context of God having boundaries for us. Like people get upset about the rules that God has set out for living, right? Like, well, why doesn't God allow X, Y, Z? Why does God get angry about this, that, and the other? Well, to me, it's like you look at it like it's the road. It's like he knows what is best for you. Just like the people that design the road and the rules of the road, like they're doing it not to be mean to you, not to restrict how much fun you can have, but to provide a safe environment in which you can enjoy the privileges that you have driving, but you're not going to die every time you go out on the road because there's no rules. So I think it's similar in the way that God sets up guidelines for us in how we live our life. Like it's not about restricting us. It's about giving us as much freedom as we can have and keep us safe.
Well, and I can think it totally relates to our relationships too. Like I know that I am like so strict on like the rules of the road, right? Like I know the right of way rules. I know who's supposed to go when, like I know all that stuff. And when I drive with my husband, he's like, whatever. You know what I mean? And I just get like, so I'm like, no, that person had the right of way. You have to wait or whatever. And I get so worked up because he's not following the boundaries. And yet for his personality, he's just like, we didn't die. And I get so worked up. So I think that's another thing to kind of think about. Some people are really strict on their boundaries and other people are just like, whatever.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right.
Okay. So let's talk about where we need our boundaries. All right. Where do we need them? Okay. So most of the time when I hear people talk about boundaries and when we talk about boundaries, like books that I've read about boundaries, most of the time I see them in the context of relationships, which we will get to. But the first one we want to talk about is boundaries on our time. And this is really a tricky one, but it's one that I think for women in leadership, this is a huge one for us, right? Because often we want to say yes to everything. We want to be able to be available to everyone. We want to give and serve and show up in a lot of different ways. So for me, I have set boundaries on my time around my schedule, my calendar, how much time I can dedicate to different areas of my life. And if you don't put boundaries around your time, you will be burnt out at some point. You will get burnt out. The other thing is not just your time, but your capacity and your energy, which of course is related to time. But we all have a different level of capacity at different seasons of our lives. We all have different energy levels, again, different times, different circumstances. And so if you don't set boundaries on how much you are willing to pour out in your calendar, in your time, in your energy, you're going to end up resentful, frustrated, burnt out, or your relationships are going to fall apart. Like there's so many negative things that can happen when you don't set boundaries on your time. So that's one area where we need boundaries.
And I honestly think like that goes both ways. Like I need to set boundaries so that I will say no to things.
Right.
It's not even just people like wanting me to do stuff. It's like, I will say yes to everything if I don't have in my mind what my schedule is, what my capacity is, sort of what season I'm in. It's not just for like other people asking, it's so that I won't say yes to everything. Yeah. And so I think that the boundary is not just for other people. It's me understanding what I need in this season and how I can stay healthy. And like, I know this sounds kind of weird, but it's a form of self-care, right? Like when we stretch ourselves too far, we don't have those times to reset. We don't have those times to really stop and reflect on what's going on in our lives. And like, it just spirals out of control. So that boundary of our time is both for others and for ourselves. So
another podcast episode that we dive into this specifically on is episode 171 with Christy Wright. In that episode, we talked about how to find life balance, discerning what's most important. And it's really based around Christy's book, which we'll mention at the end. But if you want to dive a little bit deeper on boundaries around your time, that would definitely be a great episode to listen to. And just I want to give a practical example on this one before we move to the next one. Practical example on boundaries around time is deciding when you're going to get done working. And I say this because this is one of my issues, right? As I have a business and I work from home, it is very easy for me to do things, spend time with my family, dinner time, do things with my family in the afternoon, early evening. And then when everybody's kind of settled down, I'll pop open my laptop and start working away on other things. And the other night I found myself doing that. And I was like up until 10 o'clock, like doing other work. And I was like, wait a minute, what am I doing? I'm not setting a boundary on my time and actually forcing myself to stop working. So that's a practical example of, why we need and when we need boundaries around our time. So,
and I think too, like just to add on that before we move on, like it can be so difficult when what we do is something we love and we feel a passion for. And we are multi-passionate women. So I could throw myself into a number of things that for me don't feel quote unquote bad for me to do. Right. But if I don't give my time for my brain to just do nothing or kind of relax, reflect, just have that relief time, then when I do go back to those things, I'm not going to be as fresh and as ready or maybe even as creative as I need to be in those other areas. So that's just something to think about. I feel like we need to remember that sometimes the good things are not always something we need to be doing at all times.
Right. Yeah.
So,
all right.
Okay. So the next one is relationships. And really, boundaries in relationships are two ways: how other people treat you and how you're going to treat others. So when you talk about how other people are going to treat you, it's sort of, if you allow other people to treat you in a certain way, it's going to continue. And you can't expect someone to treat you in a particular way if you have not communicated this. So we're going to be diving into sort of the how of this in a later part of the episode when we talk about these practical things. But one of the things that I think is really important to understand is this communication piece. A lot of times we feel like we've set up a boundary that we haven't communicated, and we get really upset when someone crosses over that line. But we haven't said to them, that's a line for me. You can't cross it. And so we just assume that that's something people should know. But people have different experiences, different personalities, different relationships that they've had in their lives, that certain things have been permissible or not permissible. And you can't expect someone to automatically know what is a boundary for you and what is not. So, I mean, this is an obvious thing, but relationships are going to go so much better if you can communicate these things ahead of time. Now, if you're super self-aware and you're starting out with a new friendship, I wouldn't say, here are my boundaries, 1, 2, 3. But I do think that it is something that you can easily say to someone that you have a really good relationship with, like, hey, that's not going to work for me. Here's what I need to remain safe, or however you want to communicate that. And we'll talk about that. But as always, talking about it ahead of time before it's a problem is always a good thing. So
let's go into, we're going to just talk about like a few categories of relationships, because I think for everybody listening, they're going to be having boundaries in different areas of their relationships. And they kind of are very different based on your circumstance. So So work, let's talk about work. So in work, you might need boundaries with your team members. So if you are supervising other people, or you are overseeing people in some capacity as a leader, you're going to need to have boundaries set up with those team members. In some workplace scenarios, it might be that the boundary for you as a leader or as a boss is that you're not going to really share a whole lot about your personal life with team members. Now, in other circumstances, that might be different. It might also be boundaries about, how you spend time together, whether you go out after work for dinner or things like that. There's boundaries that you can set up, again, about how you're going to treat your team members and how you're expecting them to treat you. And then you might have boundaries with coworkers, people that you are kind of at the same level at, and how are you going to interact with them and treat them. And then you may also need boundaries with your boss or with clients if you have a business and you are working with clients who are hiring you for work. And so just as an example, as what Holly was talking about, like the issue of not knowing, expecting people to treat you a certain way that's in your head that you haven't communicated. I just have a practical example of that. If you are somebody who has clients that you work with, or even really any scenario here, is just in some situations, somebody might be doing something to you that you don't like. They might be treating you a certain way that you don't like. And you can find yourself getting really frustrated, getting irritated about it, grumbling in the back of your mind. You may even be talking to coworkers about it. Oh, I can't believe my boss is asking me to do this thing. They keep asking me to stay late every single week, every single day after work. They want me to stay late, and I don't want to stay late. But if you never set the boundary and say, I cannot stay past this time, that is my family time. I have to get home by 6:00. If you never say that, then your boss is just going to keep asking you to stay late because you are doing it. And a lot of times when I work with my own clients in my business and my business coaching, they are getting frustrated because clients are asking them to do things that they don't want to do, but they are never saying no, and they are never drawing that line and setting that boundary. So it is really important that we have boundaries in our workplace scenarios and that we communicate them with the people that we work with.
Yeah, I think that's so important, especially in the workplace. We just assume people know these different things, right? And they don't.
Well, and
they just don't.
They don't, or they don't care unless you push back. And I've had this be the circumstance where people are afraid to set a boundary because they're afraid that they could lose their job, or that they could lose a client, or there could be some consequence. But honestly, most of the time, people will respect you if you set that boundary. Mm-hmm. They will respect it.
Yes.
And especially if it's a boundary that is fully in line with the job expectations that you have or the role description. Like if you got fired over that, setting that boundary, that would probably be like a problem. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't ever happen, but I think a lot of women, especially, keep doing things or keep saying yes to things that they don't actually want to be doing, instead of just setting a boundary and standing up for themselves. And it's time for us to stand up for ourselves.
Ooh, I like that.
Okay. Next one, Holly.
Okay. Family. So this is a special one. Super special.
I'm glad I gave this one to you. Woo.
Okay. I'm probably going to say something I shouldn't in this one, but that's okay. So probably one of the most important ones is with your spouse. We're going to talk about some different books, but boundaries in marriage, I think, are super important, especially because we come into marriages with certain baggage that we need to work through. We need to process, and we're growing, and we're, trying to be healthy, and we're having our walk with the Lord and stuff. Hopefully that baggage will start to go away. You know what I mean?
We'll deal with it. We'll
deal with it. But at the same time, that does not mean that you are not going to be, to some extent, reactive or sensitive in a certain area. And so it's really important to be able to carve out those lines with your spouse and just be able to say, look, I'm not ready in this area. I think the really important thing is it's not about building walls to keep them out. It's about understanding where both of you need to be healthy. And it's not just about someone else coming in and attacking you is not the right word, but moving in on your own boundaries. It's also identifying how you've had negative things in the past and how you could be unhealthy towards your spouse and setting boundaries for yourself as well.
Yeah.
So if you know that you have an unhealthy reaction when you're overtired or when you're super stressed, setting a boundary for yourself, like I put myself in timeout. I am happy to put myself, I have literally said to Zach, I am unfit for human consumption right now. I need to go into my room and be alone.
Right.
And so sometimes it's really important to give yourself a timeout and not get your junk all over other people. But I think that's probably one of the most important relationships to do that in.
I love that you said that it's not just about how you want your spouse to treat you, but it's about how you're treating your spouse. And again, it's like, I know that there's been times where I have said to my husband, I have to stop engaging in this conversation because I don't want to say something that I'm going to regret. And I need to walk away and like take some time to process and pray before we continue this conversation. And so again, it's not like I'm not telling him you can't do this or this is hurting me. It's about me and how I am, the space I'm in. So just like you said, giving yourself a timeout, giving yourself a break, and knowing that there are times where we need to set that boundary for ourselves.
Yeah. And I think the older you grow, the more mature you grow, oftentimes more of the boundaries are about yourself.
Yeah.
About the other person.
You realize, oh, I can't change the other person. I can only really change myself.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing is with kids. So obviously a lot of this goes into healthy parenting and sort of the harmony of your home, but boundaries with your kids, obviously a lot of that is safety, but other things are just about how we treat others, how we as a family are going to live out our values, live out our love for the Lord. Like this is how we as a family act. And I think a lot of times in parenting, we sort of look at the child and we say, you can't do this, you can't do that, da, 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 da. But I have found that a lot of times we just say, in this family, we don't do that. And that's not like super crazy parenting tip. I'm not an expert in parenting, but it is a discussion about boundaries. You know, this is how our family acts and this is how we are going to behave in the world. And I think that kind of helps kids have a sort of pride isn't the word, but like a belonging to the family. Because I'm part of this, this is how I act. And so we can talk about all sorts of different things when it comes to kids and boundaries, but that's sort of the one that kind of came out to the top of my mind. But it also helps them understand how they're going to behave in the world. So then in the future, when they have spouse relationships, work relationships, friend relationships, they kind of already have those boundaries set up to say, well, in my family, we weren't allowed to call each other names. So I can't call my friend this name. You know what I mean?
Right.
So another more difficult one is with other family members. And I know when you become an adult child, having a boundary relationship with your parents is often one that a lot of people talk about, but it doesn't necessarily have to be parents. It's just other family members outside of that sort of nucleus family. And those can be very difficult relationships to kind of figure out because it's really important to maintain those. But at the same time, there are some really toxic people out there that you don't get to choose your family. And sometimes we have those toxic people in our lives. And so sometimes those boundaries are being completely cut off. And sometimes those are with really sort of strict rules. And other times it's just like, hey, like, I'm just not going to engage in that behavior. So there's quite a spectrum of how we can have boundaries with our other family members.
Yeah. And I just want to say like a couple things on this topic of family. One is, we're not talking about abusive situations at all here. Clearly, in those circumstances, it's a very different dynamic. And well, that's actually when boundaries are even more essential and necessary. We do have some other episodes, definitely at least one episode on domestic abuse if you need to get some support or just want to learn more about that, because I think it is something that we need to be more aware of in the church. And one of the things that I remember from that conversation was just how often it is very not obvious to onlookers from the outside. And we talked a lot about for women in those circumstances, how they can get support and actually get out of an abusive situation. And so I just want to mention, like, I know there are times when you may have to say, like, I am not going to have contact with a person anymore. And that is very difficult because most of the time in our family, even when there is dysfunction and even when there is messiness, we still usually love the person that things are happening with. And I can think in my family, there's been times where we have had to have some very clear boundaries on things with people that we love dearly and we care about dearly. But we cannot continue to engage with them for whatever reason. So I just want to kind of mention that because I think it's something that someone might be dealing with. And as a woman, having to set some of those boundaries, even if people don't believe you, even if people don't support you, in the long run, it often is necessary for the sake of safety for yourself and for your family. So anyway, that's just my little blurb about that, which is not a comfortable thing to have to talk about, but I just think it's important to bring up. Yeah. And I also think the other thing that I wanted to mention, and that's a little bit less of an intense topic, is around kids and teenagers. Like, I think one of the things that we're working on in our household is boundaries with our daughter around social media and screen time and all of that. Right. And that's like a whole thing that our parents didn't have to deal with as much. Those of us who are in our age bracket, a little bit older. And so, it's again, and what I see with some people that I know is that they just decide not to set any boundaries with their kids. And they don't put in any guardrails. They don't put in any. And you know what? Kids are getting damaged and kids are getting hurt and kids are getting taken advantage of by people because their parents are not setting any boundaries. So I think I am more than happy to be the mean mom in this situation because, and I just had a conversation with my daughter the other day about it because I was like, I'm not setting up these boundaries or these rules to be mean to you. Or because I don't trust you. It's not even about not trusting you. It's about not trusting other people out there 100%. And not knowing what you're going to see out there and so that's just and it's an ongoing conversation for all of us who have kids and teens. But again, something that boundaries are necessary for.
Yeah. That's such a hard topic to deal with. And I know like for me as a parent, I want to like bury my head in the sand and not think about it. But if I do that, it's more detrimental to my son or, our children than if we just take a deep breath and deal with it because we're going to have bigger issues down the line if we don't. And we are going to have to deal with it at some point. So, all right. Do you want to talk about the next section of people?
Yeah. Okay. Friends. So we also need boundaries with friends. And that is one that is probably, like Holly said, don't just start a new friendship and be like, well, these are my boundaries in relationships. So here we go. But also, I think the thing I was thinking about with friends this morning was sometimes in a new friendship, we need to have boundaries on how much we share with somebody when we first start getting to know people. And this is a very nuanced thing that there's different comfort levels that people have with sharing and things like that. But if you are building a friendship, a lot of times it's wise to build that gradually. And I know we've talked about that in other episodes, but there might also be times where you have to set up boundaries with friends if they are doing things that are not comfortable for you or expecting things that are not realistic for you. I know, again, because we are all in different seasons of life and we may have different work responsibilities and things like that, it's very easy for friendships to get complicated as adult women. And often that complication comes because we don't communicate with each other about what our capacity is or what our boundaries are. Right. And so one friend might be expecting you to be available and text back as soon as you text every single time. And your responsibilities or your own boundaries may not allow for that.
Yeah.
But if you don't discuss that, if you don't say, hey, if you don't hear back from me right away, it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's because I've decided I'm only texting a couple times a day with my friends. And just that conversation could alleviate so much stress versus if you never communicate the boundary or you never dive into it with your friend, like there could just be a lot of hurt feelings for no reason at all, other than lack of communication.
And I think when I think about this, it kind of makes me a little sad because I do think that some relationships have just been abandoned because boundaries haven't been clear. And instead of having the conversation with someone, they've just kind of cut them out of their lives. And so I do think that it is important to have those conversations because you could be missing out on a really great friendship that could be super beneficial to both of you. So if you're in that situation right now, I just encourage you to try to have those conversations with those people that you feel are safe, but you're not sort of seeing eye to eye, or you're not kind of in the same spot when it comes to those boundaries. I think sometimes we need to fight a little bit harder for our relationships, especially females, especially female leaders.
Yeah.
We need to fight a little bit harder for our relationships because we super need them. So that's just my 2 cents on the topic.
And I'm going to add one more thing to that because it's something I've been seeing lately going around on the internet. And it's this concept, this idea that if someone in your life isn't bringing value to you or isn't doing their part in the relationship, then just basically cut them out, get rid of them.
Yeah.
The idea of you are the sum of the 5 people you hang out with or whatever, like that whole thing, there is some level of truth to that. But I think what you're saying is so valuable because I think we're getting lazy and we're getting like entitled in our relationships. And we're thinking, well, if somebody isn't giving me value and if they aren't pouring in as much into the relationship as I'm pouring into them, then I'm just done with them. And we're not willing to do the hard work of having the hard conversations and digging into what's going on. Maybe they are going through like a really hard time. Now, I understand there are times that there are people who just take, and they never give, and there's not any balance. And so, yes, there may be times that you decide to spend less time with somebody, but I don't think that the idea of cutting people out or just getting rid of people in your life because they're not doing something for you, I don't think that's a biblical or Christ-like approach to relationships. So that's my little rant.
Well, and it's very conditional.
Yeah.
Like Christ doesn't give us his love in a conditional way. It's unconditional. Yeah. And I'm not saying that we should endure abuse, but what I am saying is we need a little bit more Christ-like love in those situations. And I always think, when people say those sorts of things, I'm like, have you always been that 100% friend that you're asking other people to be? Because I know I haven't. When I'm going through things or like when I'm having a really hard time with my anxiety, I isolate and I don't reach out to my friends and I don't text them back. And it's not because I don't love them. It's just, I'm not really a great friend at that time. You know what I mean? And so it's like, but I've had to say those things to some people because I've been like, look, I'm not trying to hurt you, whatever. I'm just going through something and I can't always verbalize that. And it's just like, I know for myself, I can't expect that from other people when I can't give that 100% of the time too. So yeah. Okay. The last area that we're going to talk about in this specific part is our behavior. So we need to have boundaries around what we will do and won't do, what we take in, how we behave. And a lot of times when we think about this, sort of in its, I won't say most extreme, but in its most crucial way within ourselves, are those things that we have temptations or struggles with. Or like when we talked about with our spouse, we know that we're going to act a certain way when this certain thing is sort of tipped off or this button is pushed. Like we need to have boundaries with ourselves in those areas. So when we're talking about temptations or struggles, oftentimes that can be food, alcohol, certain entertainment or media, social media, sleep. I mean, there's lots of things that can become idols or passions or can consume our life in really strong ways based on sort of all sorts of different things. But we have to be able to set boundaries. And a lot of times we talk about this way back at the beginning of the podcast when we talked about self-awareness. Yeah. That's really where we can identify those areas that we struggle with that we need to create boundaries on. And it's through that reflection and through perhaps our mentor relationship or some of our close relationships that sometimes those things need to be pointed out to us. Sometimes we're totally blind to them. So it's really important for us to have boundaries with ourselves to say, when this happens, I need to do X, Y, Z. So like when I am just over dramatic and I want to just yell at everybody, or, I'm just mad at the world, I need to go give myself some time and space. Yeah. Or maybe I need a snack.
Yes. Right. Maybe I just need a good night's sleep and a good meal.
Yeah. And I think it's important for us. And this probably is an example of a boundary more than anything. Like, I'm not going to make a really important decision when I'm in this place. I'm not going to make a really important decision about X, Y, Z when I'm stressed or tired or my anxiety is high. I'm going to wait until I can kind of come out of those situations and make really healthy decisions. So that's an example of one that we would set for ourselves, but there's lots out there.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think we should dive into how to set boundaries, because we've talked about the areas where we need boundaries. So let's dive into how to set them. And so, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say, it might be a good idea if we kind of talk about the top 4 and then dive into each one so that people kind of know where we're going.
High level.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So we have a 4-step process, which we totally made up. So this is our 4-step process for setting boundaries. Okay. The first one is decide. The second is communicate. Third is enforce. And then the fourth is reevaluate and adjust. Okay. Yeah. So this is like, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll start with decide, because I had this idea last night when I was working on this, is boundaries are about making a decision. Ultimately, if we want to just boil it down, boundaries involve making a decision. So decide. There's 4 kind of things you need to look at in deciding what your boundaries are going to be. 1, what are your values? So what is most important to you? The things that you value in terms of how you're going to live your life. What are those? Secondly, what are your priorities? So that's a little different than values. I feel like values are things like you value honesty, or you value health, or you value financial freedom, or those are values. And priorities are like, well, it's a priority for me to spend every Saturday with my family, or it's a priority for me to get done working at a certain time, things like that. What safety do you need to maintain? That's a really good thing to decide ahead of time. Decide what's safety. And then lastly, decide what keeps you healthy. So again, when I'm thinking about my boundaries, I might know that what keeps me healthy is not having a bowl of ice cream at 10 o'clock at night before I go to bed. Like, that's something that would keep me healthier. Or keeping me healthy would be, having time to go outside and go for a walk every day. And so these are things that if we decide our values, our priorities, our safety, and what keeps us healthy, then we can figure out, where do I need boundaries? What are my boundaries going to be in all of these different areas? Okay. Do you have anything to add to that, Holly?
Yeah. So I think sometimes, like, I know for me in the past, it's been even difficult to get to this point. In other words, I know there's something wrong, but I don't know why it's wrong. And I can't really say what this person is doing or what I'm doing is wrong. And so by knowing your values and your priorities, it can really help you figure out where someone's crossing a line or why that violation is a big deal to you.
Yeah.
And it can help clarify why you need to decide. Because sometimes when we haven't had really healthy relationships in the past, we've only had sort of really difficult relationships. When someone does something, sometimes we can't even identify that it is bad or wrong and that they shouldn't be doing it. And so I think it's important to realize that this deciding sometimes can be the biggest part that you have to process. And it can take you a while to get there. So I wanted you to give yourself some grace, but I also want you to have the tools to understand that if you have your values and priorities kind of set up, then it's easy for you to identify, well, they violated my priority that my family is the most important thing to me or whatever that is.
Yeah.
And so when they're constantly asking me to do X, Y, Z, that's why it bothers me. And it's not that they're, in some cases, it's not that they're even doing anything wrong, but it feels wrong to you because it goes against what you sort of stand for. Yeah. And a lot of times it makes it even easier to have that conversation when you can identify these things. And that's in the next area. But I just want to be able to say that sometimes it's hard to understand where the rub and the friction is coming from. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to be confused about that and to need to figure out that clarity there before you can make the decision. So,
yeah. And sometimes boundaries come because we have been proactive and we've decided ahead of time. But a lot of times boundaries, you set up a boundary because there has been some kind of conflict or challenge. Yeah. And I know, especially I found that in my business, when I first started out, I just basically didn't have any boundaries. I was just like responding to every message that came in every day or night. And somebody would ask me to do something, I would just drop everything and do it right away. Like I didn't have any boundaries around how I was operating my business. And it wasn't until I got to the point where it was like, oh my word, this is going to drive me crazy if I keep doing this, that I decided to set up, these are my business hours. And this is when I'm going to, how long it will take me to respond to messages. And this is my turnaround time for work. Because there was like conflict there that I realized and it really boiled down to values and priorities. Those expectations or those requests that I was getting from other people were keeping me from spending time with my family and enjoying a Saturday, going for a hike or doing things that were important to me. Yeah. And it was like, no, I shouldn't have to be dropping everything for a client.
Yeah.
My family is more important than my clients, So then it helped me to set up the boundary.
And I think it's important to remember that other people are not the only ones that violate our values and priorities. We do it to ourselves. So I think it's important to remember that as well, that we sometimes get into, whether it's we're just kind of going along with the crowd or we see this shiny object or you're kind of in a rut or whatever. Sometimes we have to stop and reflect and be like, does this even support my values and my priorities? Because you're sort of doing it to yourself. So I think it's important when we create a boundary for ourselves to decide this value is more important than this comfortable thing that I'm doing or this rut that I'm in or whatever.
Well, right. I mean, if we go back to the idea of just your health, for example, like you might know, well, okay, what is important to me is getting enough sleep at night. And I might have to set a boundary on myself to say, I'm going to turn off my light and put down my phone by X time so that I can get enough sleep.
Yep.
But what's easier and comfortable is to keep doing the habit and the thing I've already been doing, which is staying up way too late and watching Netflix and
scrolling till 1 a.m.
This may or may not be a real life scenario. We'll just,
it may or may not be real.
But as an example, we like to give practical examples on this podcast. So you don't feel
of things
confused.
That other people deal with.
Other
right?
people. Right. Okay. What's the second step in setting boundaries, Holly?
So the second thing is to communicate. So communicate the boundaries to others or communicate them to ourselves. I know sometimes we make the decision and then we don't actually create the rule. Like even saying, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. We're just like, I made the decision and so I'll stick with it. But no, we need to create the boundary and then we need to communicate it. Maybe we need to even write it down for ourselves. But okay, so how we're going to do this? We're always going to be kind and respectful. We can even try to take some of the emotion out of it. I know sometimes we get really worked up and you did this and you did that. But if we haven't communicated the boundary, we can't really get upset with them. So we want to be kind and respectful to the best of our ability. And that sometimes is going to take the most self-control and the most like Holy Spirit power because we really want to really kind of come in and sometimes attack people like you violated this boundary. You should know better. But again, if we haven't communicated it, we can't really hold them to that, even if we feel like they should already know. The second one is no apologizing. So you don't always owe an explanation why. So what I mean by that is you do not have to apologize for your boundaries if your boundaries are bothering someone, that's okay. Like, we want to have this to be healthy, but it's not something that we're going to give unnecessary apologies for. These are the things that you need to maintain safety and health and peace. And we're not going to say, I'm really sorry, but da 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 da. We're just going to present it and we're going to be okay with the consequences. This next one is, I'm going to give you permission. No is okay to say. And what we really need to think about is when we say no, it allows us to say yes to other things and honor our priorities. So I'm giving you the permission right now to say no. This next one is learn to be okay with silence. So oftentimes we feel like we have to fill a conversation. And so if you've presented a boundary and that person is not responding or just kind of like processing, we feel like we have to continue talking. It's okay to set the boundary, communicate it clearly, kindly, and respectfully, and then stop talking. Let the person respond however they're going to respond. And honestly, that's going to give you a barometer of how this boundary is going to go. Like if the person can go, I respect that, I understand, I can move on. Or if they fly off the handle, like you understand where that's going to eventually go and how strongly we're going to have to stick to this boundary. And then the last one is people are not always going to like it, but hopefully they will respect it. And I say hopefully because we cannot anticipate or make someone else respect it. The only thing we can do is continue to enforce it. But we need to understand that not everyone's going to accept the boundaries that we put up. And that's for a lot of reasons. Maybe they haven't had anyone set boundaries with them. Maybe they haven't ever had anyone say, when you act like this, it really bothers me. So I'm just not going to participate in that anymore. Everyone's been enabling them or whatever it is. And honestly, when we're doing it with ourselves, we don't always like it. Like I want to watch Netflix until 2 a.m. and still be able to be bright and bushy tailed in the morning, but I can't. But hopefully I will respect the boundary that I put on myself because it's healthier in the long run. So those are just a couple of key guidelines or things to be thinking about when you're talking about communicating boundaries. Do you have anything else to say on that?
I love the steps that you walked us through. And I think just on like a practical note, for example, in a workplace scenario, you might have a boundary that is during meetings, we're not going to take phone calls, right? Or something like that. Or phones, we're not going to be looking at our phones during a meeting. Yeah. So as a leader, you might have that boundary in your head and you might be holding a meeting and people are looking at their phones or somebody takes a phone call and walks out. But if you never communicated, this is the boundary of how we're going to run our meetings, then you really have no right to be upset with them, even if it seems common sense to you, you know, and many others. So I think that is just the other piece is like communicate when you have a boundary, whether it's in a workplace scenario, family scenario, personal, whatever it is, we do have to make sure that we communicate. And often it requires more than one communication. Yeah. You know, another thing I do is sometimes on the bottom of my emails, I say, emails will be responded to within 1 business day, like something like that, like support emails so that people they don't have an expectation that they're going to get an immediate reply. So yes, communicate. Okay. Next step is enforce. Oh, this is fun. Like
one of the harder ones.
The rubber meets the road. Somebody breaks your boundary. Yep. And you might have to remind them of your boundary. Hey, you know what? That's not something I am willing to do. This is what I've set up as my boundary, my guideline, whatever it is. And just remind the person or the situation of your boundary. And then if it continues, you may need to just remove yourself from the situation or from the relationship, or, you know, in some situations, you might have to remove someone else. Now, obviously you can't like physically remove somebody from a situation, but again, use your judgment, use your common sense in this example. Protect yourself and or make sure you have clear consequences. So if this continues to happen, this is what I am going to have to do. You know, if you continue treating me this way, I am not going to continue spending time with you. Right? Like that would be an enforcement of the boundary. Another resource that we have in this regard is Confident Conversations. So in that mini course, I do go through some examples of having conversations, having some of these hard conversations that are sometimes related to boundaries, related to what happens when someone doesn't honor or respect that boundary. And one of the things that I can think of with this is, and I'm not going to get the quote right, but it's basically the idea of your procrastination is not my emergency.
Yeah.
And so like a lot of times people will come to you with something that they need done pronto.
Yep.
And in workplace scenarios or even volunteer situations, there may be times when you can do it and when you accommodate that. But if it's an ongoing thing that you're constantly getting a last minute request and you're expected to do it in an unreasonable amount of time, you may have to have a boundary there and enforce it. And that enforcing is going to be saying no. And it's going to be, allowing the other person to live with the consequence of their last minute situation, which again is not fun and not easy to do. And I know that I tend to be a people pleaser and I tend to want to make people happy. So I generally tend to say yes to things, but I have had to learn the hard way that I can't. And I do have to sometimes say, you know what, that's not something I'm able to do. And then deal with the consequences of that.
And sometimes those, we'll call them repeat offenders, just need you to say no one time. And then they will kind of fall in line and say, oh, I've done this so that I never have to do that again. And it's a reminder to them that they need to sort of get themselves together because you're not going to put up with it. And so oftentimes people won't recognize the behavior that's detrimental to you until you actually say, well, remember I said I need 24 hours notice before such and such. And because you didn't do that, you'll have to find someone else or whatever. And oftentimes, it only takes that one time for people to kind of get in line. And it's honestly like, there are going to be people who are repeat offenders and who will continue to do it and continue to just sort of buck that boundary. But it's your job to enforce. That's really what it comes down to. So,
I'm going to throw in one thing here that we haven't really talked about, but in some situations, especially when it's boundaries with yourself, you may need accountability.
Yeah.
And not something we love talking about, but if you want your boundaries to be enforced with yourself, there might be a situation where you are actually having to talk to someone else about that boundary that you've set up. Like you said, you mentioned the idea of going to bed and not staying up until, and so if you told me, hey, Esther, I'm going to start going to bed at X time. I don't want to be, staying up past this time. And I did this recently with you. I had something I was trying to do and I texted you. I said, can you check in with me on this thing? And you did.
I did.
And then I was like, oh, shoot, I have to tell her. And so there's accountability on if we set something for ourselves, sometimes, usually we are not the best at holding ourselves accountable.
Yeah.
Most of us are not. So,
And I will say about that accountability, like, one of the reasons I was able to come back to Esther is because the moment she asked me, I set a reminder in my phone because I knew for a fact I wasn't going to remember. So that is a way of enforcing your own boundaries. Sometimes you just need to create automatic things that will help you enforce those. And so I was able to text. We were literally like on a layover between flights and I was like, oh, here it comes. All right, here we go. I'm texting her.
Yes.
Whether she likes it or not.
I still actually have to give my full report to Holly on what she texted me about. So
she gave me a half report, but I'm not.
It was not a full evaluation of what my progress was. So,
okay. So speaking of evaluation, number 4 is to reevaluate and adjust. So one thing that may be important to do is after you've kind of decided, communicated, enforced, is to really reflect on the whole situation. Did that go the way you needed to? Was that boundary set appropriately? Does it need to be more strict? Does it need to be less strict? Does it need to be communicated in a different way? That's really what we're talking about here is reflecting, and maybe we need to reframe all those sorts of things. But the way that we're going to be able to do this and sort of pull out those things that need to change is we're going to ask the Lord. We're going to ask him to speak into these situations. And, we're giving you lots and lots of practical tips, but honestly, like, he needs to be invited into this whole process.
Yes.
And I know we're only talking about it at this point, but, sometimes, like, especially when I was talking about that deciding, asking the Lord, this doesn't feel right. Why? Help me understand. Help me figure out. I need to communicate with this person. Prayer before, like, even though this is, in the last one, he is part of this whole situation. But I do think that it is important to be asking for some guidance and discernment on how the whole process went and whether or not we need to readjust or reframe or reevaluate that boundary that we've set. The second one is speak to a trusted friend or mentor. So a lot of times, having someone on the outside is super helpful. We've talked about this before. We've talked about safe people. We've talked about trusted people. And sometimes they can enlighten us on things that we're missing, especially when we're talking about boundaries with ourselves. Like, hey, maybe you're continually failing at this boundary because you haven't considered X, Y, Z. And maybe, that's the outside perspective that we need. And then we need to be okay with what the action we need to take is. And so what I mean by that is we may need to completely walk away, or we may need to enforce or have things be stronger, more assertive, or we may need to do some work on our own, on ourselves, and we may need to loosen up and tear down some walls. I think sometimes we think about just protecting ourselves, just making sure that no one hurts us, when in fact we need to do some growing and some healing on our own. And the boundary we've put up is not about the other person. It's actually about our sensitivities or our sin even, or our, something that is really about us. And if we were healthy in that situation, the thing that the other person is doing wouldn't be an issue. So sometimes we really need to think about whether that is external or internal. Like, why does this happen? And is it my sin? Is it someone else's? Is it someone else's behavior that they don't even understand? Like, I think it's really important to evaluate all parts of this and really figure out what the action step is. But oftentimes it may not be exactly what we think. And sometimes we do need to loosen some boundaries to allow people to have the freedom to grow. A lot of times we just assume that people aren't growing, and we need to put these really strict, tight boundaries on them. And they're a different person than they were 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so we need to give them the space to kind of grow and change with the boundaries that we're giving them. And perhaps sometimes those can be loosened and sometimes they can't. But it's really important to reevaluate every so often.
I love what you mentioned. Obviously having God in this process is so key. And I think even from the beginning, where we're looking at our values and our priorities, I mean, that's something to be in prayer about. It's something to be allowing God to speak to you about. I know that when we just went to a conference in Alabama, it was a church leadership conference. I know God talked to me while I was there about some things in my life that I need to change. And it's like constantly being open to what David says in the Psalms, like, search my heart, oh God, like, try me and see if there's any wicked way in me. Like, we need to be open to what God is saying to us about our issues. And it's so easy to point out what everybody else is needing to change. But really, like you said, a lot of this is about our own behavior and how we are treating other people, how we are treating ourselves, honestly, treating God in our life. So I think having God in the process is so key. So that's good to keep in mind.
Okay. Do you want to share our one last tip?
Yeah. This is my special bonus hack. Don't try to set too many boundaries at once, right? It's like this issue that many of us do where we're like, all right, my life is a mess. I'm messing up on so many things. Like, I'm eating ice cream at 10 o'clock. I'm staying up until 2 a.m. watching Netflix. I'm not I don't know, just like all the things. And so we
Mhm.
try to like set a whole bunch of new boundaries at once, whether it's with other people or ourselves. And I think that sets us up for failure because
Mhm.
it's very hard. A lot of times setting boundaries, it takes a lot of emotional strength
Yeah.
to actually do the enforcing
Mhm.
and the communicating, all of that. And so if you're trying to do it with like 4 different people and you're trying to do it with yourself and you're setting up all these new things, it's often, I think, going to be hard to follow through on all of that. So I
Yeah.
would generally say, like, do this gradually, learn to build
Mhm.
up the resilience that you need to set the boundaries and then like to say no. And the more you do it,
Yeah.
you realize, oh, I can do this. I do have the strength to do this. And again, get the support that you might need, the extra
Yeah.
accountability in place to do this as well.
And I will say one last thing that kind of reminded me of this when you were talking about this last tip is that this is hard work. There's a lot of mental load. There's a lot of processing that happens. There's a lot of, maybe stepping outside of your comfort zone to have conversations you're not used to. Like, I want you to give yourself the grace that you might be a little bit exhausted from this. There might be some mental load. You might need a little bit of extra rest, a little bit of extra alone time, a little bit of extra support from those people that are closest to you who understand that you're setting this boundary, and give yourself the grace that it can be very emotional, especially if it's with someone that is very close to you and that you have a really strong relationship or a really close family member. This can be so exhausting. So I want you to give yourself some grace that as you're starting to create these, that it's not just a set it and forget it, one and done. This is something you're going to have to revisit constantly, especially with someone who you've never set a boundary with. It's going to be a lot. I mean, you think about a kid that you say like, don't touch that, don't touch that, don't touch that. Like for the first day or so, whatever this object is, they're going to keep touching it. And then the next day they might get distracted until they forget about it. But if you give up on the second or third time, you're going to have to deal with it tomorrow and they're going to try to touch it again. You know what I mean? Like whatever the thing is. And so just remember that at the beginning, it can be a lot more of a heavy lift than it might be later on. So give yourself the grace and give yourself the space that you might need to actually walk through this process because it's not easy. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And especially we all have different personalities. But if you are a personality type that tends to be a people pleaser or tends to be someone who doesn't like conflict, is conflict avoidant, this is going to be even harder for you. I was just having a conversation with somebody recently who is having a very hard time with this idea. And it's because they don't want to hurt someone else's feelings.
Yep.
And I said, you know what? You have to be okay with hurting someone else's feelings in order to share where you are at. Like it's important for you to share where you are at and to not be taken advantage of. So, okay. We have several like books and other podcast episodes that we've had on this podcast before that we just want to hit on real quick before we wrap things up.
Okay.
So a couple books that I have read recently. One is Boundaries by John Townsend and Henry Cloud. I feel like that's like the ultimate book that is recommended clearly for this topic. So definitely check that one out. Another one that is one that I've read recently is The Emotionally Healthy Woman. It's by Jerry Scazzaro. I'm probably saying her name wrong, but anyway, and her husband, Peter Scazzaro. Anyway, that's a really good one. And there's a lot of boundary talk in that one. And one of the things that surprised me in that one was honestly, some of the boundaries that she set were like, whoa, that is like a very extreme boundary.
Really?
And so it was interesting for me because I have oftentimes, I think I've been very much like, well, I couldn't do that. I couldn't set that boundary because that would be whatever, that would hurt someone too much or that would upset people or whatever. But like if you read the book, you'll understand what I'm saying. Like she had to do some pretty significant boundary setting with her husband in particular, but also in other scenarios that were in order to get some things changed. So and then another one that I'm going to mention, and then Holly, I'll have you mention the podcast episodes, is another book that I've read, which is not specifically about boundaries, but it's Radical Candor
Mm.
And I'm not going to say the second half of the book name because this is a rated, whatever.
G?
Clean.
Or
I was going to say G, but no, it's rated clean. But there's a little bit of language in the second half of the book. So this is not a faith-based book, but it is a great book for bosses and leaders that are supervising people. And there's a lot of talk. I think it's related to boundaries in the sense of how to really be clear with people and how to make sure that you are clearly communicating with the people you are leading around what's expected of them. And then sometimes having to let people go. Anyway, I recommend that for anyone who is a boss or has a team that you're supervising to check that one out.
Yeah. All right. So the last three are all people that we've had on the podcast and they all have books. And I think that these are great. So feel free to go back and listen to the episodes and then decide perhaps whether or not you want to actually get the book. But the first one the book is called Nice, Why We Love to Be Liked and How God Calls Us to More by Sharon. Is it Hottie? I always get that wrong.
Yeah.
Hottie Miller, Sharon Hottie Miller. And that's episode 80. And obviously these links will be in the show notes, but this is one of my all-time favorite books that we have had the author come and talk to us on the podcast. Honestly, this book makes me think of that clarity that I talked about on how we actually have to decide on the boundaries. I think that in an attempt to be nice, we have not set boundaries and we have not called people to the highest level of integrity that they should have, or even ourselves. So this is a great book for that and kind of sheds a light on sort of a societal norm that we're expected to just be nice.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're not kind and not respectful, but so
right. Well, she does in the book, she differentiates between niceness and kindness.
Yes.
And they're two very different things.
Yeah. And I love that clarity. So the second one is Shrinking the Integrity Gap with Jeff and Tara Matson. So we had Tara on episode 121. And oh my gosh, this is a phenomenal book about integrity and how it's one of the things that's so missing in leaders in our society and how, we have these huge leaders and then we see them fall from grace and like the things that could have been put in place before those things happen. So I think that is I think it's a very important book to read as a leader. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
And then the last one we're going to talk about is Take Back Your Time, The Guilt-Free Guide to Life Balance with Christy Wright. And Christy talks about different seasons and she talks about your priorities and your values, a lot of the things that we were talking about. And a lot of it is framed around time, but I think that a lot of it can be used in the context of relationships. She does talk about that to some extent. But I think that it's so important when we're trying to make those decisions. And I love the fact that she says guilt-free, because oftentimes we make these boundaries and then we feel super guilty about them. And so I think this is a really great sort of answer to that. Like, how can I do this without feeling guilty? Or how can I do this without hurting someone else's feelings? Or how can I make this justification to myself that it's okay that I even do this, right? So that's a lot of what Christy talks about. And I think it's super important for us to kind of dive into that. So that was episode 171. And again, like I said, all these links will be in the show notes. But obviously, like if you're on your app, you can kind of just scroll back to find where these are. So episode 80 was Sharon. Episode 121 was Tara Matson. And then episode 171 with Christy.
Yeah. So we hope those resources are helpful for you as you think about boundaries. And you know what? I just remembered one more that I will try to put in the show notes is the episode I mentioned with, I believe her name was Charlene, that talked about the issue of domestic violence and abuse. And so I think that's another key one that will be put in the show notes.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on to wrapping things up.
I thought this was going to be a shorter episode.
Holly, we say that every time. We're like, this is going to be a shorter one. And then we go for an hour or more. I don't even know.
Okay. I don't even know.
We're not capable of short form podcasting together.
We will
individually, we can do it. Yes. Individually, we can do it. But when we're together, we just can't stop talking. So
because what's your average length on the business podcast? Like 20 30 minutes? Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
I think we just are adding our time together.
All right. Well, let's ask this question. Would you rather be an expert at one thing or pretty good at many things?
Okay, I'll go first. So I don't know, but I'll tell you why I don't know. Because I feel like I'm pretty good at a lot of things.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm an expert in anything. And I kind of am, I get a little jealous of those people who are like, I'm this world renowned expert in this specific thing. And they know all the ins and outs. And I'm like, I don't feel like I could ever get to that level because I'm a shiny object person. And so I'm the person who has tried a zillion crafts, a zillion hobbies. I have tried my hand at a million different things and I've only gotten to beginner level in every single one. And that's enough for me. Like the end, I'm done.
Well, you're beyond beginner level in your work that you do in your business.
Well, yes.
But,
I mean, that's true. But
yeah.
I guess I'm thinking about it I don't know. I'm not thinking about it as far as my business goes. But
okay. Well, I am always thinking about career, that kind of thing. That's always what goes to my mind.
So I guess I want to be an expert in one thing, but I don't want that to mean that I'm terrible at everything else.
Okay. Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Because I'm self-taught in a lot of things. Like I taught myself how to make cakes. I taught myself how to crochet. I taught myself how to do a lot of things. And if my expert status in one meant that I couldn't teach myself how to do other things, I wouldn't want to give that up. So that's your mixed answer. I didn't give a clear answer on that.
You could be an expert at learning to do new things.
Yes. Yes. Good job.
Okay. Well, I am going to say my answer is I would also rather be an expert at one thing.
Yeah.
Because I feel I'm the same way. I feel like I'm pretty good at a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I can learn just about anything, and try a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what I've done in my life is just like you said, like either learned to do new things or got an education or whatever around a variety of things. And this used to drive me nuts because I actually did like a thing with my life coach. I did this testing thing.
Yeah.
And you can be a generalist or a specialist, like in the way you're wired, like people can be either a generalist or a specialist, and generalists are like jack of all trades, somebody that is kind of good at a bunch of different things. And a specialist is that person that can really become excellent at one thing. Mm-hmm. And I was literally like smack dab in the middle between those two things on my testing. I was like not a specialist and not a generalist. I was like, this is so annoying. Mm-hmm. But it kind of explained to me why I've always struggled with that, because I've always been like, well, like I can do these things. I'm pretty good at this, but like I'm not amazing at this thing. But anyway, it kind of gave me that permission to be okay with not being on either end of the spectrum. But if I had to choose, I'd probably say I would like to be an expert at something.
Did you know that jack of all trades is not the full quote?
What is it?
There's more to it.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to know what it is?
Yeah.
Okay. A jack of all trades is master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one.
Oh,
isn't that interesting? Yep.
Okay.
So we use it in one certain way.
Yes. Right.
But it really means something else.
Okay. Huh.
Isn't that interesting?
It is. Yeah. Right. So, I think that a lot of people think it's better to be good at one particular thing.
Yeah.
And I think that there are times when we need those people. I mean, we definitely need people that are really specialists in one thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I'm going to have somebody give me heart surgery, I want them to be an expert at heart surgery. Not like, I'm pretty good at like knee surgery and, elbow surgery. And then occasionally I do hearts. No, I want that. They should only be doing heart surgery every day.
I think that's important.
I think so.
Yeah, I think but
if you're going to I don't know, something else.
Well, no, I think that it serves you well to kind of learn how to learn, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like, so we bought this house and it's like, I don't know how to keep these outside shrubs alive. Like we literally came home from vacation and all of our shrubs are dead in the front. They're brown. They're dead. No. So now I have to be like, okay, now I have to learn how to be a gardener that I'm not, right? Yeah. Give me a house plant. I'm good. Outside, whole different realm. So I think that we talk about that. Leaders are learners. So I think it's important to know how to learn, but I think it's also great to learn how to master something as well. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's bad or good on either side. I think it's just what you're naturally adept at. Are you more the person that's going to dive in? Or are you more the person like me that's going to be like, okay, I crocheted a washcloth, I'm done.
Learned that. Moving on. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well, friends, thank you for being with us for episode two. I was almost going to say 20 something, but I was like, no,
I really want you to leave that in.
We're just going to let it roll. If they're with us to the end of this episode, they're our diehard listeners.
200.
200. Okay. Thank you for being here. Episode 200. You're amazing. Tell a friend. Share this episode on social media. Hopefully lots of people will want it because we got a lot of votes on our
hot topic.
Hot topic. Yep. So we'll see what other episodes are coming out later this year. But thank you for watching. My word.
I think we're done talking. I think that you have used your words for today.
I think I'm done. All right. Wrap us up,
Thank you
Holly.
for listening. And goodbye.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast, and it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.